Hello everyone, welcome back to AMH 2020, U.S. Introductory Survey since 1877. In this video, we're going to discuss America in the 1960s. The 1960s was a decade of massive political and social change in the United States. The decade saw the U.S. and the USSR come closer than ever to nuclear war, an assassination of a popular and beloved president, and several other social and political leaders, civil rights activism, the beginning of the U.S. deployment of ground troops in Vietnam, the restructuring of the American tax code, massive expansions in the American welfare state, political realignments, and monumental Supreme Court cases, the first humans going to space and to the moon, and so much more. Some Americans supported these sweeping changes, but these changes provoked a backlash amongst others. Some Americans sought to make their voices heard, while others sought escapism and to flee the challenges the country was facing. And this is an outline of some of the major topics we're going to talk about. The 1960 election, the Kennedy presidency. We'll talk about Kennedy's foreign and domestic policy. We'll talk about the continuation of the African American civil rights struggle and how African American activism evolves in the 1960s. We'll talk about losses of consensus and what is often called the loss of American innocence. And this is where the Kennedy assassination and the MLK assassination, along with several other high-profile killings, come into play. And then we'll talk about the Vietnam War, its escalation, and the social movements that it provokes in America, especially the counterculture movement. The 1960 presidential election saw Richard Nixon, the incumbent vice president, run against John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a Democratic Party senator from Massachusetts. Nixon was a Republican politician from California, and he had become vice president for Eisenhower, who was generally a very well-liked president. Ike even campaigned for Nixon in the final days of the election. Nixon ran on his experience, and he highlighted his work as vice president. Nixon, up to this point, was probably the most active vice president in American history. And for his vice president, he chose Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was a sort of political insider in the Republican Party from an old Republican family. Nixon himself was not from a very well-connected political family. He was actually from very humble origins and was kind of actually an outsider in the party, even though he had served as a vice president. Kennedy was a fairly young junior senator from Massachusetts. His youth had allowed him to avoid some of the really serious controversies that were beginning to tear the Democratic Party apart, particularly what to do with civil rights. He also came from a very politically connected family. The Kennedys were politically connected. Joseph Kennedy had been involved in the FDR administration, and he really wanted to have one of his sons, at least one of his sons, become president. The original plan had been for Joe Jr., the firstborn son, to be president, but after Joe Jr. Died in World War II, that mantle fell to Jack or John Kennedy, as he was more commonly known. For his VP, the Democrats and Kennedy chose Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas. Johnson came from a more humble background than Kennedy, who was from an elite family. And Johnson was much more politically experienced, and you might expect that actually Johnson would have been the better choice for president and have Kennedy be the vice president. But in 1960, the American people were looking for new leadership. They were looking to shake things up. So Nixon was associated with Eisenhower in the past. Kennedy was a young, fresh face, and it would have been a better choice to choose Kennedy than to choose the older and more experienced Johnson. But there is evidence that Johnson resented the fact that he was made vice president over the younger and less experienced Kennedy. So what's going on in the 1960 election? In his campaign, Kennedy argues that Eisenhower and the administration, and really by proxy Nixon, had not done enough to keep America in the lead in the Cold War. He pointed out the U.S. Lagging behind the Soviet Union in the space race, a supposed missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union in what you might call a technological gap. The Soviets were leading the space race. They will send the first satellite into space, Sputnik, back in 1957. They send the first animal to orbit the Earth, Laika the dog, also in 1957. And then they send the first human being, Yuri Gagarin, the cosmonaut, into orbit in 1961. Eisenhower had helped to found NASA back in 1958, but Kennedy is able to argue that new leadership was necessary to keep America in the lead in the space race, or rather, to take the lead in the space race. I think on the whole, Kennedy also did a better job reaching out to African American voters than Nixon did. Both Kennedy and Nixon were supporters of civil rights, but Kennedy made a more active effort to reach out to African American voters who, for many very understandable reasons, were hesitant about voting for a Democrat. But Kennedy was a Northern Democrat. He was a young member of the party, not an entrenched member, and he had a more liberal reputation. There were concerns, though, from many Protestant American voters who feared electing a Catholic president. They thought that Kennedy would be more loyal to the Pope than he would to the American people. This might sound like an odd thing to say in the 2020s, but there was still significant anti-Catholic sentiment in America in the 1960s. It was getting to be less of a factor in American politics. Catholics and Protestants were becoming more closely allied in politics, but there were still some Protestants who were nervous about voting for a Catholic. And I've talked to people who voted this election who cited this as a reason that they did not vote for Kennedy. One last thing I'll note on civil rights. While Nixon and Kennedy were both supporters of civil rights, Nixon privately called for the release of Dr. Martin Luther King, who had been arrested and jailed during the 1960 election, whereas Kennedy made a more vocal and open call for King's release. Again, this was Kennedy's more active reaching out to African American voters, something that he as a Democrat would really need to do in order to get African Americans to vote for him. During the 1960 election, Vice President Nixon attacked Kennedy for his lack of experience, his youthfulness, even though the two men were actually only 4 years apart in age. Nixon was 47 and Kennedy was 43. He also criticized Kennedy for being Catholic. Nixon himself was a Protestant, but he was a Quaker, and he was a rather non-religious Quaker, not a very devout Quaker. But the 1960 election was the first presidential election to feature televised debates. Television was becoming increasingly popular in the 1960s. By the early 60s, the majority of American houses had TVs. So it makes sense to have this kind of debate take place on the venue of television. And as I've said before, candidates that make the best use of technology or that adapt the best to it, they generally tend to win elections. And Kennedy did really great in the first presidential debate. He looked good on camera. He was handsome. He had tanned skin. He had very nice hair. He really curated his image, which was something that was very important to mid-century Americans, having a very curated public external image. There was something rugged, something masculine about Kennedy, highlighting his military service in World War II, which Nixon had also served in the military in World War II as well. In contrast, Nixon did not look as handsome. During the first debate, he didn't wear television makeup, and it made him look nervous, tired, and unkempt. He had a very visible 5 o'clock shadow. His hair was disheveled. He looked kind of sweaty and nervous on camera, and image was important in mid-century America. Americans were very concerned with how they looked. And we still are today, but it was much more of an issue in the early 1960s. And so Kennedy, largely because of image, largely because he just looked better and was less nervous on camera, he won the first debate, although Nixon did better on the later debates as he adapted to this new media style. Nixon also made some pretty bad mistakes in his campaign strategy. He promised to visit all 50 states. The United States had become a 50-state nation they'd become states in 1959, Alaska and Hawaii. So we now are a 50-state nation. It's an exciting thing, but you only have so much time when you're a presidential candidate. You have to focus on the swing states. That's more what modern presidential campaigns did. And that's more what Kennedy did, a more strategic campus speaking tour. And so Nixon, his image wasn't as well crafted. His campaign was stretched too thin. And you're going to see it does not help him on election day. Here is the return for the 1960 presidential election. It was actually a very close election with Nixon picking up some southern states where Kennedy, as a northern liberal Democrat, struggled. Kennedy also was dealing with a independent spoiler candidate named Henry Byrd that would have taken more votes away from the Democrats in the South than from the Republicans. It was a very close election. Essentially, it came down to two states, Texas and Illinois. Johnson, being a Texas politician, he will help to bring in Texas for the Democrats. But in Illinois, it was very close, and essentially it all came down to Chicago. And there were allegations of voter fraud in both states and that organized crime groups had helped Kennedy win in Illinois. But scholars have debated these issues for years, and anytime you have a very close election, you're going to hear about reports of voter fraud and things of that nature. It happens every single election, but it becomes much more of an issue when an election is very close, as the election was in 1960. Kennedy ultimately finishes with 49.72% of the popular vote compared to Nixon's 49.55, but then he did a lot better in the Electoral College. We will begin our discussion of the Kennedy presidency by talking about his domestic policy. Remember, this is Cold War America, it's mid-century America. There's a lot of fear about mutually assured destruction and concern about the future, but there's also a garrison mentality. There's a desire to have unity and to embrace American consumerist culture, and Kennedy is able to really craft that image for himself. He's presiding over a rapidly changing American home front, though. The civil rights movement is rising, and of course there are external threats as well across the world. To meet this changing world, Kennedy will assemble a cabinet that consisted of both academics and business leaders, people like Robert McNamara of the Ford Motor Company, Ivy League intellectuals that he would have met during his education. He brought in what were called the experts, a lot like what FDR did during his presidency. Kennedy proposed a series of legislation called the New Frontier. He actually first used this language during his campaign for presidency. But the New Frontier, it's designed to evoke images of both the American West and the New Deal of the 1930s. This is going to appeal to both conservatives and more liberal and progressive people. Kennedy, again, is trying to appeal to both of these groups. The New Frontier will include expansions to social welfare systems and safety nets, things that actually have been expanding even after World War II during the Eisenhower presidency. That's going to appeal to more progressive voters. But Kennedy is also going to support the lowering of tax rates on all classes to stimulate economic growth to fund these new programs. That's something that's going to appeal more to conservatives. And we saw this in earlier periods in American history. In the 1920s, for example, tax rates were cut, but the actual revenue that was brought in didn't fall. So you can have lower taxes and you can pay for these programs. That was what Kennedy believed would happen. Of course, he's talking primarily about these domestic programs and some increases to defense spending, but spending is going to be much more significant because of the escalation of the Vietnam War. And much of the New Frontier programs, the social safety net expansions in particular, are not going to be fully realized until the Great Society program that is led by Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's successor. And as a presidential candidate, Kennedy had signaled his support for African American civil rights, but once he became president, he began to soft pedal his advocacy for the movement because he needs to, keep his coalition together. He needs to keep white Southern Democrats in the party. In his inaugural address, President Kennedy urged the American people to Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And to that effect, Kennedy supported increasing the defense budget to prepare the country for future conflicts. The defense budget was increased by over $3.25 billion, about $28 billion in today's money. The U.S. will also increase its role in the Vietnam War as well. We're going to go from about 1,000 or so advisor troops on the ground to about 16,000 advisors on the ground that are there to train the South Vietnamese military, although there is evidence of clandestine operations, combat operations being undertaken by these advisors. Kennedy will also follow through on the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion had been in the works for years. It was a CIA-backed operation to remove the Castro regime from Cuba using Cuban expats, exiles, and refugees that had been trained in military tactics. Unfortunately, though, the Bay of Pigs invasion is going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which is generally recognized as the moment, the closest moment that the United States and the Soviet Union ever came to a hot nuclear war. And I'll unpack these things further in the upcoming slides. In his inaugural address, Kennedy also promised that the United States would take the lead in the space race by getting a man onto the moon, a human being onto the moon, before the end of the 1960s. In the beginning of the space race, the Soviets were in the lead. They launched Sputnik in 1957. They sent Laika the dog into space, the first animal to orbit the planet in 1957. Sadly, Laika died in space. And then they sent the first human being into space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin in 1961. The United States, though, is going to catch up to the Soviet Union. Eventually, I would argue, is going to beat the Soviet Union in the space race by getting to the moon first. And I would class the space race as not just technological development, but as foreign policy as well, because we were trying to signal our technological and cultural superiority to the Soviets, and we're also experimenting scientifically. And these space exploration technologies also have military applications as well. Everything is connected to the Cold War in this period. Here are some images from the Apollo 11 spacewalk on July 20th, 1969. In the words of Neil Armstrong, the first human being to set foot on another celestial body, the moon, he said that it was one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And a bit more about the space race. The United States and the Soviet Union, they both employed ex-Nazi scientists to assist in their technological development. The U.S. had Operation Paperclip, in which about 1,200 Nazi scientists shared their technology with the United States. The Soviets also had a similar program called Operation Osovyachim. That's in the English Latin alphabet, it's spelled OsovyAkhim. And the Soviet Union took a lead in the space race due to three factors, I would argue. They actually had more Nazi scientists working for them than the United States did, which many people don't realize. The Soviet command economy being so centrally planned, it could focus on large prestige projects like space exploration a bit more quickly than the United States could as a free market capitalist country where there is less central management. And the final issue, and this may upset some people, but I think it is the truth, the Soviets on the whole were more acceptable of greater risk-taking, and I would say in many ways had a lower regard for human life. They also had the ability to censor their press and to keep their failures a secret in the way that the United States could not with its space program. Again, though, both sides, both the U.S. and the Soviets, are taking significant human risks with their space programs, and there will be casualties for both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And the space race, it runs from 1957 to about 1975. 1975 is generally considered to be the end of the space race because in 1975 there was a joint U.S.-Soviet Apollo-Soyuz mission, the Soyuz program being an early Soviet rocket program. During this period, the United States will send 32 astronauts into space, and 3 of them tragically will die. Technically, our 3 astronauts that die, they actually die on Earth. They don't die in space. And in the same period, the Soviets will send 20 cosmonauts. That's what Soviet astronauts are called. They'll send 20 cosmonauts to space, and 4 will die. For the U.S., those casualties took place on Apollo 1, and the Soviet casualties happened on 2 separate Soyuz missions. And there are some conspiracy theories about the space program. There were disgruntled Americans who claimed that the U.S. never really landed on the moon. This was because these disgruntled Americans had lost their jobs with the U.S. government, and they were acting on old intel and old information. When they worked for the government, the U.S. did not have that technology, but by the 1960s they had developed it. People will also say that the moon landings were faked because there are no visible stars in the space sky of the moon. You have to remember, though, too, that there is still day and night on the moon, and the sun will drown out the light from other stars on the moon, just as it will on the Earth, even though the moon does not have atmosphere. The Soviets, in their way, also, I think, had their own kind of conspiracy theories about the space program. They didn't deny that the United States had landed on the moon. Rather, they said that they were never trying to get to the moon. They were not wasting money on frivolous capitalist projects like landing on the moon or going to space. This isn't true. When later archives were opened up after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviets were also trying to get to the moon as well. They even built their own landing craft and things of that nature, but they were not able to land on the moon. There also are others domestically inside the United States that will criticize NASA for being too expensive. Some, including what might be called black nationalists, will criticize NASA expenditures as well because they took resources away from helping impoverished minority groups. You really see this in Gil Scott-Heron's 1970 spoken word, almost like proto-rap song. It's called Whitey on the Moon, and that's his language, not mine. So these are just some interesting facts to think about with the space race. I should also add, too, that the casualty rate for astronauts went up considerably with the introduction of the space shuttle, which overall was supposed to be a more efficient type of spacecraft than using rockets and modules, because the shuttle uses rockets to get out of Earth's atmosphere. But it was the space shuttle, I think, that was the real killer of astronauts. You see this in the Challenger explosion and the Columbia explosion, which were in the space shuttle. But the space shuttle was a post-space race technology. The first space shuttle launch was in 1981. That's 6 years after the space race came to an end. Now we'll talk about some more controversial elements of Kennedy's foreign policy. First of all, we'll discuss the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was undertaken in April of 1961. The landing actually took place on April 17th, 1961. And there were several problems with the Bay of Pigs invasion. U.S. military officers, most notably Curtis LeMay of the Air Force, said that this invasion was not going to be successful, that the Cuban rebels would need more significant air support to protect them when they were landing and to keep the sky clear of communist Cuban aircraft. But the CIA and Kennedy's cabinet believed that they could undertake the this attempted Cuban counter-revolution, the Bay of Pigs invasion. And it was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. That bay had already been called that long before the actual assault took place. But there were several other problems. First of all, there is considerable evidence that the Castro regime knew that the invasion was coming, that they had spies in the United States, particularly in South Florida, that reported back to Castro what was coming. Other factors as well, because the Castro government knew what was happening, they were able to suppress and basically round up Cubans. They took them and locked them in places like movie theaters and things like that to keep them from breaking out and helping the rebels once they had arrived in Cuba. So there was no revolution or counter-revolution against Castro. I don't think the will was there amongst the Cuban people, and those that might have joined the rebels, they had been largely sequestered by Castro's government. But the Cuban exiles, their code name was Operation 40, and while they had some initial successes storming and securing the beachhead at the Bay of Pigs, they began to lose the initiative, and Kennedy withheld the air support that they really needed to be able to maintain a more continuous presence. And eventually, they're going to be captured by the Cuban military, and they're going to be sent to prison, and they're going to be treated very harshly while they are in prison. Really, it was a mistake by the Kennedy administration. After the operation failed, Kennedy removed Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, from his position. Kennedy did not like the CIA. Some people think that he said he wanted to scatter the wind or scatter the CIA to the wind. He didn't like the CIA, but I think Kennedy was too smart to say something that provocative. Other U.S. military officers and leaders in U.S. intelligence, they proposed other operations to remove Castro from power. One such operation that was proposed was Operation Northwoods, in which false flag bombings and hijackings would be used as a pretext to militarily intervene in Cuba in a way that would be not condemned by the Soviet Union because this was counterterrorism. Again, this is happening in the Cold War. Had the United States used more appropriate air support, it's very likely that the Soviet Union may have attacked targets in Europe in retaliation for the targeting of attacks in Cuba. I think, though, that if this was such a concern, which it was, then Kennedy probably should have called off the operation altogether. If you're not prepared to go all in, you shouldn't do it. And, Kennedy basically was blaming the CIA director by firing him, but really he's the president of the United States. If he wants to know why the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, he should have looked in the mirror. At the same time, he is a young president. He's dealing with people who have been in politics a lot longer than him. I can understand the pressure that he felt. But as I said, after the Bay of Pigs failure, the United States will instead focus on other clandestine operations. Operation Northwoods, which thankfully did not happen. Operation Mongoose, in which Cuban infrastructure was targeted by bombings and things like that to try to demoralize the Cuban people against Castro. And then things like assassination attempts were undertaken against Castro as well. Some really, really bizarre and almost spy movie-esque attempts to assassinate Castro. Things like poisoning the ink in his pens, for example, so the ink would get on his fingers and he would die. Kennedy also, his administration consulted organized crime groups for advice on how to plan these assassination attempts. So what's going to happen from the Bay of Pigs is that Cuba, which was already an enemy of the United States, is going to become even more of an enemy, and understandably so. The Soviet Union is also going to, become more confident to support Cuba by sending missiles to the island nation, and also more confident in Europe. The Berlin Wall is going to be erected in the wake of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. And the Berlin Wall was a fortification that kept East Germans in communist East Berlin from escaping to the free and democratic portions of West Berlin. Remember, Berlin is deep inside the German Democratic Republic, the communist East Germany. So there's a lot of negative fallout for Kennedy following Bay of Pigs. The most significant fallout, though, was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In response to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the U.S. began placing Jupiter missiles in Turkey and in Italy, both NATO allies, and the Soviet Union began to send missiles to Cuba. And there's debates about whether there were missiles already there before 1962. Castro wanted to have missiles and weapons in Cuba to basically act as his own version of mutually assured destruction, that if the United States were ever invaded or were ever to invade Cuba, then the Cubans could launch these Russian missiles at the United States. Um, Castro famously said that he would rather have Cuba be burned to cinders and ashes than to be taken over by the United States. So it's another second form of MAD, mutually assured destruction. But there were like spy plane images that suggest there may have already been missiles there. But the Soviets, again, because of Bay of Pigs and because of the placement of the missiles in Turkey and in Italy, they began to send additional missiles for sure to Cuba. And Cuba is a mere 90 miles from the southernmost point of Florida at Key West. And the missiles, if they were placed in Cuba, they would have easily been able to hit targets on the East Coast, including Washington, D.C., and even cities as far west as Denver. The Kennedy administration initiated a naval blockade of Cuba, in addition to the embargo that was already in place to prevent the Soviets from delivering the bombs. There was a 2-week standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet navies, and the U.S. and the Soviets finally reached an agreement. Nikita Khrushchev, you can see him on the left-hand side of the slide, he agreed to have the missiles be returned to the Soviet Union, and the U.S. also made public promises to not invade Cuba in the future. Secretly, the United States also removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. And then a nuclear hotline, a phone line, was established between the U.S. and the Soviets so that if there was ever a future nuclear standoff, negotiations could be peacefully conducted to prevent total war and mutually assured destruction. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is generally considered to be the event that was most likely to start a nuclear war, a planet-destroying war, potentially, between the U.S. and the USSR. And Kennedy's prestige did increase after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He handled the crisis well. He had averted nuclear war. The U.S. was able to get some concessions out of the Soviets as well, the missiles being returned back to the Soviet Union. He kind of was able to rehabilitate his foreign policy reputation after the Bay of Pigs debacle. And so on the foreign policy front, Kennedy is generally considered to be a fairly successful foreign policy leader. And one last note I'll make, based on my own family history, there was a lot of fear about the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was real concern, particularly in Florida, where my grandparents were living. My grandmother lived in Palm Beach County, and she said that the fall of 1962 was a time of great fear. People were concerned there might be a possible Cuban invasion of Florida. She said Army trucks and convoys were driving down U.S. Highway 1 right outside of her house, and there was a lot of fear and concern during the crisis. Thankfully, the crisis, of course, was averted. We've talked a bit about Kennedy's foreign and domestic policy, so now we'll shift gears a little bit and we'll talk about the continuation of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Kennedy, of course, was a supporter of civil rights as a presidential candidate, and he still supported it as president, but he had to be very careful with how he handled the subject so as not to lose parts of his voter coalition in the South. But there was a lot of violence towards African Americans into the mid-20th century. Lynchings, violence by groups like the KKK. So the civil rights movement had made some significant gains in the 50s. The Montgomery bus boycotts, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but there was more work to be done in the 1960s. As mentioned before, African Americans had long advocated for freedom and equality in the United States and against violence and discrimination. This goes back into the 19th century and earlier, we would argue. So the civil rights movement, we generally refer to it as being in the 1950s and the 1960s, but it had considerable antecedents. The World Wars accelerated the African American activism struggle for freedom, and the Cold War also was an accelerant too, because again, the United States wants to project the image of unity and of liberty and democracy, that they are the good side in the Cold War, And it's difficult to do this when African Americans are discriminated against, when they don't have full civil rights, and when they're facing violence and lynching and oppression in some cases from the government. And African American civil rights leaders recognize this. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., on the right-hand side of this slide, he would found the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I talked about its founding in a previous video, but the SCLC will continue to be active in the 1960s, and King and the SCLC will support nonviolent direct action or peaceful protest, and in some cases civil disobedience, but of the nonviolent variety. King and his supporters believed this kind of activism would be the most successful. It would be the most likely to win middle-class white Americans over to their cause, and it would get the most positive media attention. So in 1961 and 1962, King, who was from Georgia, he focused his activism on Albany, Georgia. And the protests in Albany were not a success. King was arrested and jailed, which was not really the problem. Really, the problem was the police in Albany, Georgia, acted with a surprising degree of restraint towards King and towards the nonviolent protesters. It didn't get national attention. Essentially, for nonviolent protests to work, you need to have a very authoritarian and violent response from government security forces. That's what the scholars generally say. So King is going to shift his activism out of Georgia and into Alabama in 1963. By the way, it was actually Billy Graham who bailed King out of jail in Albany, Georgia. Billy Graham was a supporter of the civil rights movement and a personal friend of King's. Shortly before and even after King's activism in Albany, you have the Greensboro sit-ins and sit-ins in other parts of the United States. To start, in Greensboro, North Carolina, local college students with SNCC. SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was a more radical civil rights organization. It was more student geared. Its leadership was younger, and they focused on protesting segregationist policies at the Woolworth lunch counter. Woolworth was kind of like a drugstore, similar to like say a Walgreens or a CVS pharmacy, but it had a lunch counter attached where you could go and have hamburgers and hot dogs, very basic lunch food. The thing was, while African Americans often worked at Woolworth, they could not be served at the lunch counter. It was segregated. So African American college students, as well as some white allies, they went and sat at the Greensboro lunch counters and said that in light of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, local laws and store policies were now illegal and that they ought to be served as customers. And the Woolworth stores did not serve them. Other white restaurant patrons in some cases attacked the sit-in protesters, throwing food at them, yelling at them, spitting on them, assaulting them, and then the Woolworth protesters would be arrested for trespassing. These were sit-ins. While they are acting non-violently, they are breaking local laws. And the young people, the young activists that engaged in these protests, they actually went through very strict, almost like military training before they could actually go and do these protests. They would stand in lines and be yelled at by other SNCC members. They would have things thrown at them, and they were taught to not react when they're being physically abused by counter-protesters. There was a lot of discipline that was required to make these protests successful. But the sit-ins at the Greensboro, North Carolina lunch counters, they actually lead to Woolworths ending their segregation policy because these sit-ins and the violence by the counter-protesters, it brings so much negative press to Woolworths and so much loss of business that the business actually changes its policy. And in many cases, you actually see that businesses are often very favorable towards going against segregation because they want to be able to sell to both white and black customers, and segregation is bad for business. There's also going to be sit-ins at St. Augustine in Florida in 1963. In fact, the Woolworths where they took place, it's now a jewelry store, but they've kept the original doors from the Woolworth store. So it's a nice piece of history in St. Augustine, which is a very, very historic town in America. Moving into 1963, Dr. King chose to focus the SCLC's efforts on Birmingham, Alabama. And they chose this for two reasons. The first reason was Birmingham's downtown was segregated. Black patrons could not go to the stores in downtown. Um, so there was discrimination to be challenged in the town of Birmingham. In addition, the police commissioner of Birmingham, Eugene or Bull Connor as he was known, was very aggressive, very forceful in suppressing civil rights protesters. He was going to provoke the violent, oppressive response from security forces that are needed to make civil rights protests work. And you can see some examples of this on the right-hand side of this slide. Attack dogs being used against protesters, fire hoses being used against protesters. Connor himself even drove around in an armored personnel carrier, sort of a tank-like vehicle to show a very authoritarian response to the protests. But this is actually according to plan for King and the SCLC. And the protests by King and his supporters, they are intended to be peaceful. They are mostly peaceful. When you're dealing with this kind of aggressive response from the authorities, you're going to, in some cases, see some violence as well, but they are peaceful protests on the whole. And King will be arrested along with hundreds of other protesters. And again, this is by design. The idea is to basically fill up the Birmingham jail and create such a nuisance and such a national outcry at the treatment of protesters that things will have to change in the town of Birmingham. Here are some images from the Birmingham protests. The protesters, they dressed in their Sunday best. Men had a nice haircut, maybe just a mustache, no other facial hair. They wore a nice suit. Women dressed in very nice middle-class women's attire, and Black Americans were still following what we would call very white standards of beauty and of propriety. And this was done to get middle-class white Americans to identify with the protesters. And of course, these protests are primarily nonviolent, peaceful protests that are suppressed very violently. King was arrested and put in the Birmingham jail. While he was in the Birmingham jail, he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. He actually was not given pencil and paper to write in jail, so he had to write his letter or manifesto actually on the margins of newspapers. In the letter from Birmingham jail, King advocated for nonviolent protest. He explained the origins of his style of activism, citing Gandhi and other leaders in the past. And he articulated some of the same ideas that are going to be very prominent in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech that he gives later that year during the March on Washington. He also ends on a rather ominous note, saying that if nonviolent protest fails to lead to real political and social change, you could see increased radicalism and in some cases increased violence. This is an idea called political jujitsu. You see it in people who study peace studies and social activism, that you'd rather deal with peaceful protesters and negotiate with them than dealing with a violent uprising or an insurgency. So this is the letter from Birmingham jail that was written during King's incarceration after the Birmingham protests. And by the way, in the months following the Birmingham protests, there were basically terrorist attacks by the KKK in Birmingham, particularly at African American churches. In one case, a church was blown up and several young African American women were killed. This led some people to derisively nickname the city of Birmingham Bombingham. And the FBI only did a token investigation of these bombings. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were very against Dr. King. They spied on him. They recorded his private conversations. We even think that they tried to intimidate him and tried to get him to commit suicide. This is the March on Washington. It took place in August of 1963. Its official full name was the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. It was meant to be a very unifying protest, not only for African Americans, but for blue-collar white Americans who wanted better jobs, who wanted better union representation. And it was a major moment in the civil rights movement, a very unifying moment. At the March on Washington, King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he said he dreamt of an America where his children could play equally and freely with white children, and he dreamt of an America where people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the contents of their character. And he gave that speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the same place where Marian Anderson sang to protest segregation back in the 1930s. There were, of course, whites who criticized King, but some African Americans criticized King as well, most notably Malcolm X. Malcolm X was in the Nation of Islam, which was a sort of an offshoot of Islam. It has some different beliefs than traditional Muslims do, but Malcolm X was more radical than King. He was more open to ideas of black nationalism and black separatism, and some people considered his stances to be racist against white people. It was said that Malcolm X's hate was born out of hate that he had encountered as a young person. His father died under rather mysterious circumstances, most likely because he was assassinated by white supremacist groups, and so Malcolm X brought a lot more anger to his activism. As time went on, though, Malcolm actually became less radical. He got into more like traditional Islam. And while he was on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, he saw Muslim people of a variety of skin colors. He saw white, light-haired, blue-eyed men who were Muslim. He saw black men like himself that were Muslim, and people from across the world. That convinced him that he should adopt different ideas about race and about civil rights. And he and King actually kind of came together in 1964 and 1965 and actually had some very positive interactions. And over time, Malcolm X adopted some of King's more unifying language. Actually, as King, interestingly enough, became more radical as time went on. Malcolm became less radical. By the way, he's called Malcolm X because members of the Nation of Islam, they removed their last names. Malcolm's original last name was Malcolm Little. They say that their original African names were taken from them when they were enslaved, so they choose the name X to represent that past traumatic experience. Another reason, too, that Malcolm X began to do things differently was because he was being basically removed from the Nation of Islam. He had criticized Elijah Muhammad, the present leader, or the leader at the time of the Nation of Islam. He had suggested that Elijah Muhammad was engaging in activities, inappropriate activities with young underage people. And so members of the Nation of Islam were beginning to turn on Malcolm as his own ideology was changing. In 1965, Malcolm X is going to be assassinated by disgruntled Nation of Islam members. And some have suggested that Malcolm X was assassinated during a speech in New York City. There's been allegations that the New York City Police Department, which was supposed to provide security for the event, they allowed the assassins into the event to assassinate Malcolm X. But that is a bit of speculation. But whenever there is an assassination of a high-profile public figure like Malcolm X, like JFK, like MLK, there's going to be discussions like that. But this is the March on Washington in 1963, a unifying moment in civil rights history. There were some differences between people like MLK and Malcolm X, but as time went on, the two actually became more similar in their activism. The 1963 March on Washington achieved many important goals for the civil rights movement. It brought African American activism and civil rights activism a greater degree of visibility, national attention, even international attention, to the point that even President Kennedy had to comment on civil rights. Kennedy was supportive of the civil rights movement, but he also did not want to see protests take place because protests were bad publicity, and the police would often respond very violently, which made America look bad. But there also was great unity that came out of the March on Washington with King's I Have a Dream speech, with what you might call a unification between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And in 1964, they're able to build on these victories. And you see this in the Freedom Summer of 1964. Civil rights workers are going to be on the ground in Mississippi, getting African Americans registered to vote. even though this is going against state laws and going against the Jim Crow social customs in Mississippi and throughout the South. And again, civil rights activists, they paid a lot of attention to image and to even things like the clothing they wore. In 63, when they were protesting in Birmingham, when they were marching in Washington, they wore suits, they wore their Sunday best. They did things a little bit differently in 64 in Mississippi. Instead, activists dressed a little bit more informally. They wore blue jeans and denim shirts. They really tried to look like working class agricultural workers and blue-collar people. And they did this to try to reach the blue-collar black Mississippian population, especially in rural areas. They wanted to have the local African Americans feel more comfortable getting registered to vote. So they had the civil rights workers dress more like local African Americans. The thing is, though, the Freedom Summer does escalate to violence. 3 civil rights workers are going to be killed by the KKK. The state of Mississippi basically declined to bring charges against the KKK members, as well as some local law enforcement that had possibly assisted in the abduction and killing of these civil rights workers. Eventually, there were federal charges that were brought in, but the killing of these 3 civil rights workers and the state of Mississippi's reluctance to bring justice to their killers, it's going to help to inspire the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which the Civil Rights Act of 1964 mandates that the U.S. government must get involved to protect the civil rights of people in the states. And later civil rights activism, particularly the Selma March of 1965, is going to help to inspire future additional legislation on the federal level, like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is the Selma March of 1965. African Americans, led by Dr. King and others, planned to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the capital of the state. Montgomery was the site of the bus protests 10 years earlier, which were a success. They were protesting against violence and discrimination, particularly violence and discrimination that was keeping African Americans from being registered to vote, violating their constitutional rights. What happened was the protesters were nonviolent. As soon as they had marched out of the city of Selma, as soon as they'd crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge — by the way, Edmund Pettus was a former Confederate officer that the bridge was named after — they were set upon by the Alabama State Police, and one of the protesters actually was killed. And this violence was supported by sheriff's departments. It was even supported by the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who was a outspoken segregationist. He famously said segregation then, segregation now, and segregation forever. He even tried to physically block desegregation of the University of Alabama using his own body. And these protests and the violent response, it provokes a national outrage. The media was favorable towards the protesters, and it also will lead to the Voting Rights Act of August of 1965, which specifically called for the U.S. government to protect the voting rights of U.S. citizens, particularly African Americans. African American activism evolves after 1965 for several reasons. The first reason is because by 1965, they achieved some very, very important national legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 to protect black civil rights, and then the 1965 Voting Rights Act to specifically protect African Americans' right to vote, along with the rights to vote of U.S. citizens. So they'd achieved some important goals. So you have to keep moving. Your activism must continue. The revolution must move on. Another reason that activism changes after 1965 is just because you've passed these important sweeping federal laws, it doesn't mean that racism and racial discrimination just go away overnight. Instead, you're going to focus on other types of inequities, housing inequities, police violence targeted towards African Americans, and you're going to find that the movement will actually become more radical as you move past these civil rights goals. This is the long-term, the longue durée African American activist movement It focuses on civil rights for many years, but then it also focuses on larger social issues, especially after 1965. Now, there are some important pieces of legislation that come around after 65. Loving v. Virginia, 1967, which made interracial marriage. That was a Supreme Court case that led to interracial marriage being legal. But as I said, the movement morphs and changes. It moves in some ways beyond civil rights legislation and more towards what might be called racial inequities in American society, whether it's housing discrimination, whether it's police violence, whether it's African Americans not having as good of job opportunities as white Americans. You also see that other movements are going to become more salient in African American activism, including the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement had some similarities with earlier Black nationalist and Black separatist movements, but the Black Power movement that emerges after 1965 is more radical. You really see this with groups like the Black Panther Party, and things are more divisive as well. Groups like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're actually going to expel their white members in 1965, and they're going to drop their commitment to nonviolence. They're going to become the Student National Coordinating Committee. So the commitment to nonviolence goes away. Things become a bit more radical. Civil rights legislation is less of a goal, and racial inequities become more of a goal. And things really become radical in 1968 after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which I'll talk about later in this video. You'll also see that as African American activism, as it evolves and as it becomes more all-encompassing, it's going to have a considerable cross-pollination with anti-Vietnam War activism, with college campus, so-called free speech activism, and even just general anti-American protests, what are often called New Left protests. So some of the more radical groups within African American activism, they're going to become more open to Marxism and even to alliances with communist states. And there's a cross-pollination of ideas with the New Left and with what is often called the counterculture movement, which really is very critical of American culture. Younger African American activists, they became involved in the Black Power movement. A good example of a organization within the Black Power movement was the Black Panther Party. One of its early leaders was Huey Newton. You can see him at center. He will found the BPP in 1966. You also have Stokely Carmichael as well, who was a Black Power movement leader. He advocated for Black nationalism and Black separatism. He eventually will actually leave the United States and go to Africa. A common symbol of the Black Power movement is a black fist in the Black Power salute. This salute was given by American athletes at the 1968 Olympics. And the reason African American activism had become more all-encompassing and more radical, moving towards the Black Power movement is, as I said, certain goals had already been achieved, and now other inequities were being focused on. They were focusing on the disproportionate levels of poverty that Black people experienced. They were thinking about violence by law enforcement, such as during the Watts riot in Los Angeles in 1965. And they were becoming more broad in their activism, and in some ways more radical in their activism as well. People like Huey Newton are important leaders. Ron Karenga is another important leader. And there also are Black women that were leaders in the Black Power movement, including Angela Davis. Angela Davis was a Black Power leader, but she was also a feminist leader as well, and argued that many patriarchal systems were essentially white systems, what Angela Davis and her supporters, Black feminists, what they would say. We'll talk more about Angela Davis in a future video. And these newer organizations, they were less committed to nonviolence. They believed in self-defense for their communities, or in some cases, more radical violent action, including, for example, occupying government buildings and things of that nature. And King and earlier African American activists were very focused on showing that they were patriotic Americans, that they were not communists, that they were in line with middle-class American values, the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement overall was less interested in doing this. They were, in some cases, very supportive of communist regimes and saw themselves as allies again with communists in their struggle against the United States, which they saw as a racist, imperialist power that oppressed people of color both at home and abroad. And I'm not saying that I agree with the Black Power movement. I'm explaining their rationale. In some cases, they openly carried firearms and got into shootouts with law enforcement. I'm not endorsing this sort of thing. They also engaged, though, in nonviolent community activism, setting up charitable assistance and food banks for inner city African Americans. And some African Americans did support Black nationalism and Black separatism during this period. Some of this stuff becomes more minimized over time. That way they can ally themselves with other radical counterculture and new left movements. And it's to some degree, it's understandable why essentially some of these Black Power advocates would basically be supporting their own form of segregation. They would say that being integrated into a society that is racist is not a good goal for African Americans, and therefore separatism was the answer. And again, I'm not saying I endorse or believe these ideas, but this is what the Black Power movement would say. And the Black Power movement was regarded as a revolutionary insurgency by its supporters, but as a criminal gang by its opponents. They dealt with a lot of infiltration and even assassinations from the FBI and surveillance as well. And the group is actually going to begin to fall out of power by 1970. They've been infiltrated by the FBI. There's been assassinations, and also there's personal infighting as well. Various Black Panther chapters, they want different things. There are chapters in big urban cities like Oakland, California, but then in other parts of the country, the goals are quite a bit different. I should also add, too, that the Black Panthers actually had a resurgence in the late 1980s, but groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, and even some of the original 1960s Panthers are going to condemn the new BPP and say that new organization has no ties to the original 1960s one. And while the Black Panthers themselves begin to collapse in the late 1960s, early 1970s, other Black Power organizations, some of which were even more radical than the Panthers, will begin to emerge. And some of these Black Power and Black nationalist and Black separatist ideas, they've actually come back into vogue in the mid-2010s and even in the early 2020s. And the radicalization of African American activism. Lastly, I'll say that it reflects the increased divisiveness that you're seeing throughout American society writ large. Here are a couple of images of Black Panthers. They rejected those middle-class fashion styles and notions that were popular with King and earlier African Americans. They embraced some countercultural styles, particularly when it came to longer hairstyles and the Afro style. They were rejecting what they saw as white standards of beauty. And some of these ideas are going to continue into the 1970s and beyond. They like to wear berets and leather jackets, basically military fashion, because they saw themselves as insurgents against white society. And there's various chapters and various cells. Some were more radical and more aggressive than others. There's actually been an interesting thing taking place in the kind of memory of the Black Panther Party. Historically, more left-leaning people were more supportive of the Black Panthers, more sympathetic to them, and more conservative people were more opposed to the Black Panthers because of their radical beliefs, because of their anti-American sentiments and things of that nature. I've explained, why these organizations were founded, though, of course, I did so on a previous slide. But I would say in recent years, conservative-leaning people have come to actually be a bit more supportive of the Black Panthers, or at least understanding of what they were doing. They will align themselves in some cases or be empathetic with the Black Panthers because the Black Panthers did not trust the U.S. government. They were anti-government. They did not believe in social programs. They believed in helping their own communities with their own charities and food banks. And as you can see from the images on these slides, they were big supporters of the Second Amendment as well. So it's interesting how perspectives change on historical groups and historical events. Here are a couple of other new left or left-wing militant groups that are growing up in the 1960s. You have groups like the Brown Berets from 1967 to 1972. They were a Latino nationalist group that was powerful in the Southwest. They would sometimes ally themselves with farm worker organizations like Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers. And again, there's variety within the Brown Beret movement. Some Brown Berets were fighting against discrimination and racism against Latinos, which was a big issue in the country. And others did want more like Latino or Chicano nationalism. They wanted the Southwest to be its own Latino majority country. You also have the American Indian Movement, or AIM. They started in 1968, and technically they're still around today. They will occupy the Alcatraz prison in San Francisco Bay. They'll also occupy the Wounded Knee massacre or Wounded Knee battle site as well, in protest of U.S. government policies with Native Americans. What they were primarily protesting was, in the 1950s, the U.S. government began programs of actually taking Native American families and moving them off of reservations and into urban centers where they could get better jobs and have that what we would think was a white middle class lifestyle. This was seen as discrimination and as family breakup by Native Americans on reservations, and that in some ways was the genesis for AIM. I should also add that the Brown Berets, they patterned their organization off of the Black Panther Party. And there's variety within these movements, there's differing goals, but these movements, I would say, are linked to the broader, more apolitical counterculture movement, which reflected the dissatisfaction with mainstream American culture that is really growing in the 1960s. And the unrest of the 1960s, it leads to political movements and social movements, but there are also people who are in some cases insane or with really bad intentions that will take advantage of these social changes. And probably the best example of this is Charles Manson. Manson was a musician, but he eventually became a counterculture leader. He and his followers, they began to come together after 1967 in Central California as a result of the Haight-Ashbury Summer of Love that took place in the corner of Haight Street and Ashbury Street in San Francisco. Many of his followers, they were part of the more apolitical counterculture movement, the hippie movement you might call it, and they took drugs, and in some cases under the influence they would follow Manson's orders. He basically became a cult leader. And Manson had some very crazy ideas. He wanted to start a apocalyptic race war in which African Americans would rise against whites, and he would be the leader of the black faction, even though he was white. He called this Helter Skelter. He actually wanted to start false flag attacks that he hoped African Americans would be blamed for, and that would start the race war. Again, a very crazy, evil guy. And his people will brutally murder at least 9 people in the summer of 1969 under his orders. And because of this, Manson will be sentenced to death in 1971 after he was arrested and convicted. He actually is going to die in prison, though, in 2017 because California abolished capital punishment in 1972. This is the Weather Underground, also known as the Weathermen. They were founded by Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn at the University of Michigan in 1969. I'm an Ohio State PhD grad, so we always like to joke that everything that's crazy or bad comes out of Michigan, and the Weather Underground comes out of Michigan. They got their name from the Bob Dylan song, You Don't Need to Be a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows, in 1965. And they get going at the end of the 1960s, but they're active into the 1970s. And they are a nationwide radical movement that will commit terrorist attacks and bombings across the country. And they are present particularly in the cities of Chicago and Seattle. and they were committed to overthrowing the U.S. government, and they supported a lot of left-wing, new left causes, black nationalism, Marxism, anti-Vietnam war activism, and they're going to be around until 1977, although the movement is going to lose steam in the mid-1970s as the Vietnam War, the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War comes to an end, and as leaders in the Weather Underground are going to be arrested and imprisoned, often using illegally obtained evidence. And they were heavily surveilled, as were many New Left organizations. And there are also internal disagreements. As a movement gets bigger and broader, it begins to fracture over disagreements. And the image on this slide is of the 1972 Weather Underground bombing at the Pentagon. As you can see, there is considerable rising social unrest in the 1960s. The successes and the unrealized goals of African American activism lead to discontent and unrest, and not without reason. The Vietnam War will lead to domestic unrest as well, which we'll get to later in this video, and then presidential assassinations and assassinations of major figures, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, or most notably President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated. It's going to lead to the loss of American innocence. That's what many scholars say. On November 22nd, 1963, President John Kennedy is touring Texas. He's doing this because the Democratic Party needs to shore up the vote in Texas, the white Southern vote. White Southerners had reason to mistrust the Kennedy administration because of its support of civil rights. So there are very high tensions going into this tour of Texas. As they are passing through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, the presidential motorcade makes a turn at the Texas School Book Depository. Once they make the turn, 3 shots are fired. The first bullet passes through an oak tree and ricochets off some pavement, wounding a nearby onlooker. Then a second shot is fired. This shot strikes President Kennedy in the back, and we believe the bullet exits his throat and then passes into Governor John Connally, who was seated in front of Kennedy in the presidential vehicle. And then a few seconds later, we believe a third and final shot is fired, and this shot is the fatal shot. It strikes Kennedy in the back of the head, causing his cranium to explode. You've seen the famous footage of the Kennedy assassination. It was recorded by a local bystander named Abraham Zapruder. You see Jackie Kennedy, the First Lady, climbing onto the back of the car. She's not doing this to escape the shooting. She's doing this to actually grab bits of her husband's skull and brains that have fallen all over the back of the vehicle. This information, this footage can be found. I won't run the risk of showing it here just because of YouTube's rules, but it can be found so you can see what I'm talking about. Witnesses claim that there were irregularities with this shooting. Some claim that they saw puffs of smoke further along, more at the time that the third bullet was fired. Others claim that there were people that were arrested who then their arrest records disappeared. The official story was a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, who was in the Texas School Book Depository, that he fired all 3 of these shots using a Italian bolt-action rifle. Oswald had been in the Marine Corps. He had sniper training, had supposedly won medals for marksmanship. The story was that he was a good shot, although others have said that he actually was not as good of a shot as the official reports claim. Oswald had spent time in the Soviet Union. His wife was Russian, and he was believed to have radical politics. And this was known to organizations like the FBI. He also showed, I think, very obvious signs of mental illness as well. Oswald fled the scene and was eventually arrested nearby at a movie theater, where he condemned the police brutality with which he was arrested. Oswald was taken into custody, and he was eventually assassinated, actually, by a local nightclub owner named Jack Rubenstein, or Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby's motives are unusual as well. He also likely had signs of mental illness. Jack Ruby was also Jewish, and some have suggested that he killed Oswald so that people would not think that there was a Jewish conspiracy that had killed a beloved president. Others think that he did it to have revenge in the name of the First Lady. Some people claim that Ruby said, "I did this for Jackie." His motives are unusual, though I think likely he was very mentally ill as well. Some have suggested also that Ruby killed Oswald simply to silence Oswald, that Oswald, once he was imprisoned or in custody and put on trial, that he would reveal that there were other conspirators involved. And this was a moment in which America lost its innocence, because we had film recordings of the shooting, because the American people found out about it very quickly. Kennedy was shot at 12:30 p.m. He was dead half an hour later. The American media reported on it very quickly. Daytime soap operas and television shows were preempted to reveal this coverage, in which American journalist for CBS, Walter Cronkite, announced that the president had been shot. And Cronkite was usually very steely, very non-emotional in his delivery, but he actually shed a tear as he gave this report to the American people. So the American people were traumatized. Hearing about this so quickly, seeing it in a mass media world, it struck Americans more so than other assassinations had in the past, whether it was the assassination of Lincoln, McKinley, or others. And then the irregularities, the weird things that took place, the shots that Oswald took, one passing through a tree, questions about why didn't Oswald target Kennedy here when he was on Houston Street, when he would have had a very clear and easy shot. Perhaps the governor was in the way and he didn't want to shoot the governor. There's a lot of unusual questions. There were witness reports about puffs of smoke. There were others that were arrested who somehow disappeared. Recent testimonies by people like former Secret Service agents, allegedly, and I say allegedly here because we are on YouTube, they claim that when they were operating on Kennedy and on Governor Connally to try to save their lives, the bullets that were removed from Kennedy, that final bullet, and then the bullet that supposedly struck Kennedy and then hit Connally, those bullets looked very different. They may have been from a different caliber. Now, ballistics does crazy things to bullets when it strikes, when they strike their targets. It's possible because it had passed through two people. It looked very unusual, but that's why some people call that second bullet the magic bullet. Or they suggest that second shot, perhaps that was Oswald's shot, and that the third shot was taken by somebody else, some other agent that has not been discovered. And the Kennedy assassination is a traumatic experience for the American people. There was an investigation. It was called the Warren Commission, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, and they concluded that there was only one shooter. It was Oswald, and that there was no other larger conspiracy. Some people would suggest that the Warren Commission did not really fully investigate the shooting, and they just wanted to basically sweep it under the rug so that the American people could move on from this really difficult experience. Now, there were many people that did not like Kennedy and that would have benefited from having him die. Organized crime. Some people have alleged that organized crime helped Kennedy get elected. This is very sketchy and debatable. But as president, the Kennedy administration, particularly not so much Kennedy himself, but his brother, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy Sr., he went after the mob as attorney general. So they may have wanted to get even with the Kennedys because of that. Others have suggested his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who really wanted to be president. He did not want to be the vice president. That perhaps he certainly benefited from Kennedy's assassination, that maybe he had something to do with it. Still, others have suggested international agents. They have suggested that perhaps the Russians had something to do with it. This evidence doesn't appear to hold up, as various Soviet cells in America often were not in very good communication with each other, and they didn't know what was going on. You might also point to other international communists like Fidel Castro, who The U.S. government, led by Kennedy, did try to assassinate him. Perhaps a Cuban agent paid by Castro assassinated Kennedy. Others point to Israel. Kennedy was opposed to Israel gaining nuclear weapons, and that they maybe wanted to have Kennedy out of the way because he opposed their nuclearization. I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm not accusing any one specific group. I'm more interested in why people believe in these so-called conspiracy theories. People are often very dismissive of conspiracy theories. They say, oh, this is an idea that I don't like, it's a conspiracy theory. But there often is a shred of truth to these theories, and they're often believed by people who believe that they are marginalized, either with good reason or without. They're people who believe in conspiracies. They believe them because they feel they're not being told the whole story. And basically, I think conspiracy theories, they develop not because people are crazy, but because governments and people in power act in a manner that is not transparent. And there certainly was a lack of transparency with the Kennedy assassination. The American people went through a traumatic event, seeing their president gunned down. They wanted to have answers, and they were not given satisfying answers by the U.S. government. But this is the Kennedy assassination. Records have been released recently that have cast new light on what happened that fateful day, and I hope that we can learn more as time goes on. There's also a lot of unanswered questions and irregularities with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In April of 1968, Dr. King was in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there supporting a sanitation workers strike, a garbage collector strike. They wanted better pay and union benefits, and these workers were disproportionately African American. So it's the intersection of civil rights activism and larger left-leaning activism. One evening on April 4th, King was stepping out of his motel room, and he was struck by a bullet that hit him in the jaw and eventually lodged in his shoulder. He was rushed to the hospital, and he died about an hour later at the age of 39. The alleged assassin was James Earl Ray. You can see him at the bottom right-hand side of the slide. He was an escaped convict, and he was known to have white supremacist views, and he supposedly took the shot using a Bushmaster rifle, firing from a nearby boarding house across the street. But the way the shot was taken, he would have had to have taken it from the bathroom of his own motel room, and there were trees and all kinds of things that were blocking a clear shot. And there were a lot of unusual questions. The rifle was dumped away from the crime scene, and Ray was eventually arrested actually in London, having fled the country. He did plead guilty to killing King, and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison, although he later claimed that he was not guilty and that he had been framed. People have suggested that maybe he actually didn't do it, that there were other factors involved, or that other perhaps agencies within the U.S. government actually were the ones who assassinated Dr. King. We know that the FBI spied on King. They revealed a lot of unsavory details about his private life, things that King said that were very inappropriate, even possibly a sexual assault that King did not engage in but was witness to, and that they were basically going to blackmail King into getting him to commit suicide. And when King didn't do that, they may have taken the steps to end his life. But there are nationwide riots in about 100 American cities, very, very acrimonious riots across the nation, and understandably so. After King was assassinated, he was an important leader in the civil rights movement and in African American activism. You can see why there would have been nationwide protests and riots. And members of King's family, like many people after MLK's assassination, they maintain that the official story that James Earl Ray was the only killer, they say that that was not the truth, and that there was a larger conspiracy to assassinate their relative. But I don't condemn people who believe in so-called conspiracy theories. These are people who have gone through a traumatic experience and who have been marginalized to a certain degree. So it's understandable they're going to look for more nefarious explanations for tragic events. It makes it easier to cope with when horrible things like this happen. The 1960s really is the decade of assassinations. There's high-profile assassinations, not only inside the U.S., but outside of the U.S. And I'll mention one more assassination that I think was very impactful, and that is the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, former Attorney General, brother of JFK, and really a rising star in the Democratic Party. Um, he was killed in June of 1968 while at a hotel in Los Angeles, California. He was there as part of his presidential campaign that was emerging in this period. RFK was the natural choice for the Democratic Party in the 1968 presidential election. Some people think that if he had lived, he would have been the nominee for the party, and he would have been able to beat Richard Nixon in the 1968 election. And he was assassinated by a man named Sirhan Sirhan. He was a Jordanian of Palestinian ancestry who was angry at the U.S. For their support of Israel, most notably in the 1967 Yom Kippur War. As is the case with the JFK and MLK assassinations, other people have suggested, particularly within the Kennedy family, that there were other factors at play, that the simple explanation that he was killed by Sirhan Sirhan is not accurate. But again, this is how people who have gone through a traumatic experience, who feel they've been marginalized or lied to, how they're going to respond to horrific events like this. It makes coping much easier to believe that there was a more nefarious type of thing going on than just a murder. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about the Johnson presidency, and we'll start with the domestic policy of President Johnson. Johnson, he inherits the presidency after Kennedy's assassination, and he will support what is called the Great Society. This was his domestic program. It's a continuation of the New Frontier of Kennedy, but some considerable advancements are included in the Great Society. Civil rights legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, which Johnson played a major role in getting those laws passed because there was significant Democrat opposition to those laws. There were filibusters, and Johnson was a very good negotiator, was able to get enough votes to get those laws passed. As part of the Great Society, you also have extensions of social programs, including Medicare for low-income people and Medicaid for the elderly in 1965. There were programs designed to help single-parent homes, and even changes to immigration law. The Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965 basically ended U.S. immigration national quotas, which had been put in place in the 1920s. They were already being rolled back before the 1960s, but in 1965 they come to a definitive end. This really will change the demographics of the immigrants coming to the country. You're going to see a lot more Asian and Latin American, really non-white immigrants coming into America, and America's demographic is going to change significantly after 1965. You're going to see a larger foreign-born population and a larger and rapidly growing non-white population. And I'm not condemning this act by explaining these demographic changes. I'm not condemning it. Some people argue that the 1924 Immigration Act, which was dissolved in 1965, that it was racist and that it was inconsistent with changes to American understandings of civil rights. I think there is some truth to that. Others would say that having a lower foreign-born population, it meant that the country would change more slowly, and we were already dealing with very rapid change anyway. It's better not to have too many things happening at once. Some would argue that low immigration numbers is what made the social trust of the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s possible. But again, that's a debatable point that some scholars bring up. And Johnson did help to end the filibuster to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. The act did have more support from Republicans than it did from Democrats. But Johnson realized that he would have to find a way to get this Civil Rights Act passed, which he was a supporter of, while at the same time keeping white Southern Democrats in the party because in 1964, Barry Goldwater, a Republican senator from Arizona and presidential candidate, will do a really good job reaching out to white Southern voters, beginning a transition of bringing them into the Republican Party. Goldwater, by the way, opposed the Civil Rights Act, not for moral reasons because he was anti-segregation, or rather because he was pro-segregation, but he believed it gave too much power to the federal government. He later said that that was the wrong stance to take and that he should have supported it. But Goldwater is an interesting candidate. He was the first U.S. presidential candidate, that is, of Jewish descent, although he actually was a non-practicing Episcopalian, so um, he was not a very religious person either way. And he had, as I said, voted in favor of earlier civil rights legislation. He just felt that the Civil Rights Act of '64 gave too much power to the federal government. And he's going to run against Johnson in '64, but he's going to lose in a landslide, not just because of the Civil Rights Act, but his foreign policy plans were very aggressive. He talked about possibly using nuclear weapons in Vietnam to preserve South Vietnam's independence, but people witnessing this thought that these proposals were much too radical and could possibly lead to a hot nuclear war, which we had just barely averted back in 1962, 2 years earlier. And you really see this with the Johnson campaign's anti-Goldwater Daisy campaign ad, which I definitely recommend checking out. It features a little girl pulling flower petals and counting down the numbers, and then it cuts to numbers counting down as a nuclear missile is launched, basically saying that Goldwater could cause nuclear war. And Goldwater will win Arizona and a handful of the Deep South states that were angry with Johnson for his support of civil rights, but he's going to lose everything else, and they're going to call Johnson landslide Lyndon Johnson. His Great Society was very appealing to people, and it had echoes of the New Deal, and he has some goodwill because he was the vice president of a very popular president that was tragically assassinated. JFK, the Kennedy family, they were like American royalty. Um, they were part of that Camelot image of early 1960s America. Early 1960s being before the counterculture movement, before the mass mid 1960s social unrest. Here are some images related to the 1964 presidential election. On the right-hand side, you see Senator Barry Goldwater. That was his slogan, "In your heart, you know I'm right." It's a slogan that highlights that he's a man of principle and that he is unbending to the point of being inflexible and not acting in a politically expedient manner. He was a principled conservative, but he was not willing to give up his principles even if it would mean hurting his chances of election. For example, when he spoke to elderly voters in Florida, he talked about problems with the Social Security system, not a popular message with senior citizens even to this day. On foreign policy, he talked about escalating the Vietnam War and possibly even using nuclear weapons to preserve South Vietnamese independence. Again, principled perhaps, you might disagree with those principles, but unbending to the point that it would hurt his chances with voters. Johnson had significant advantages going into the 1964 election. He was already president. He'd been president since November of '63. Here he is on the left-hand side of the slide taking the oath of office on Air Force One. His wife is holding the Bible while he takes the oath, and he's joined on his left-hand side, our right-hand side, by the widow, Jackie Kennedy. She's wearing the same clothing she wore when her husband was assassinated. They asked her, "Miss Kennedy, don't you want to change your clothes?" And she said, "No, I want them to see what they did," because she still had blood and other matter from her husband on her clothing. And the fact that she used the plural pronoun they has led some people to suggest that she knew of a larger conspiracy to assassinate her husband. Even though, looking back, Johnson was in a significant advantageous position in 1964, he was concerned about his electability in the '64 election. He didn't know he was going to be landslide Lyndon Johnson throughout the entire campaign. Johnson made some decisions in the 64 campaign that will have pretty resounding effects on America. For example, Johnson will help to get the chicken tax passed. The chicken tax was a tariff that was put on imports from Europe on a variety of things, but particularly on light-duty trucks. It's called the chicken tax because European countries are putting tariffs on American chicken that was being imported into Europe and that was undercutting locally European-produced chicken. And automakers wanted there to be tariffs on these foreign light-duty trucks coming in from Europe and from Asia because these were eating into their market share. These inexpensive light-duty trucks made by like Volkswagen and Toyota and things of that nature. And the chicken tax will be put on these trucks. It's going to lead to these trucks being much more expensive and very difficult to get in the U.S., but it's a payoff to the auto industry and to the auto unions as well. And that helps to get Johnson the state of Michigan, which even if he had lost Michigan, he still would have won the election in a landslide. So the chicken tax may not have been necessary, but I would argue the chicken tax is one of the reasons why getting small, cheap, light trucks is very difficult in America, while we have these much larger kind of behemoth type trucks, and why trucks are not just a work vehicle in America. In the U.S., they also are a status symbol as well. I think the chicken tax of '64 plays a big role in this. There's also legislation in the '70s too that's impossible that plays a role in these big vehicles too. But I'll talk about that in a future video. There's another thing though that Johnson does that's much more controversial in 1964, leading up to the '64 election. And this controversial thing, of course, is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The United States is supporting South Vietnam in the Vietnam War at this point, although we're supporting them unofficially. We're using advisors. The number of advisors increased drastically during the Kennedy administration. Kennedy promised a diplomatic solution, not a military solution in Vietnam, but he did increase the U.S. troop presence in the country. It's going to increase further under President Johnson. So the U.S. Navy was operating in the waters in the South China Sea off of Vietnam. They were running surveillance and assisting South Vietnamese special forces in strikes against North Vietnam. And in August of 1964, the USS Maddox, a destroyer which was helping in these operations, was attacked by 4 North Vietnamese patrol boats, and they were attacked in international waters. After that, and this is where things get to be hazier, supposedly there was another attack on the Maddox and on another American vessel, the USS Turner Joy. And this first attack definitely happened. That is a real thing. The second attack, though, some people believe it never actually took place. It's possible that the sailors aboard the Maddox and the Turner Joy thought they were being attacked when they actually weren't being attacked. The weather was very stormy during that second alleged attack, but these supposed 2 attacks on American vessels in international waters, it led President Johnson to call for increased executive authority to prosecute the war in Vietnam, including the sending of combat or ground troops, U.S. Army soldiers, U.S. Marine Corps, Marines, etc., to the country of Vietnam, drastically escalating the Vietnam War. And domestically, some people have suggested that Johnson supported increasing the U.S. military presence in Vietnam because this is what South Vietnam needed to be successful. Johnson did not want to supposedly be the first president in American history to lose a war. Also, there were suggestions that he was concerned about his election chances in '64, more so than he really should have been, that he wasn't coming off as anti-communist enough, and that in order to blunt attacks from Barry Goldwater, who talked about escalating the war in Vietnam, Johnson would need something like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in order to send more troops to Vietnam while having support of the American people and while also not looking like an anti-communist. And we can piece some of this together by looking at the historical period, looking at the challenges Johnson was facing in the '64 election, but also later documents that came out, like the Pentagon Papers, revealed that the U.S. executive branch was looking for an excuse to send combat troops to Vietnam, and that unfortunately, this may disappoint some people. Had Kennedy survived, he very likely would have acted very similarly to Johnson in 1964. And this comes from both the Pentagon Papers and from scholarship that was done on the executive branch and on the U.S. military chiefs of staff and sort of the military high command of the United States during this period. The Vietnam War is a very complex, broad subject. Like World War II, one could easily teach an entire class just on the Vietnam War, but I only have a little bit of time in this American Survey course. So U.S. Troops, ground troops, combat troops, they arrive in South Vietnam in large numbers in March of 1965. And the American people initially actually supported the sending of ground troops to the country, a slim majority. They didn't want to see communism spread to South Vietnam. They wanted to preserve South Vietnamese independence. Although there was significant communist domestic movements in South Vietnam who wanted to be reunified with North Vietnam as a single communist country. So there's nationalist and communist factors at play in this part of Southeast Asia. And Johnson continues policies that I think would have been done by Kennedy had he survived. We worked to try to create a South Vietnamese anti-communist nationalist movement. The North Vietnamese had Ho Chi Minh as their nationalist leader who had nationalist and communist views. We had a more difficult time finding our own nationalist leader. We tried with the president of Vietnam, Ngo Diem, that's spelled Ngo-Diem, but Diem was corrupt and increasingly authoritarian. Elections were being canceled, and this is going to be a problem throughout the history of South Vietnam. And eventually, we were going to allow him to be assassinated in a military coup in 1963. There's evidence the CIA supported this coup. But Diem, as I said, was not a very good nationalist leader. While he had been anti-French, he had not actively fought against the French the way that Ho Chi Minh had. And he and his family were not supportive of nationalist movements in the country because some of these nationalist movements were communistic. Also, Diem was Catholic, and the majority of the Vietnamese people were Buddhist or they practiced other local religions. Catholicism often was linked to French colonialism, and while there were committed Vietnamese Catholics, Diem may not have been the best choice for a majority Buddhist country if you're trying to create a nationalist leader. Also, his family responded very negatively when Buddhist protesters, Buddhist monks, lit themselves on fire to protest the continued fighting. Madame New, who was a his sister, she actually called it a Buddhist barbecue. Really awful things to say. So Diem went from being an ally to being an obstacle, and he was assassinated. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution takes place a year later in 1964, and then U.S. ground troops arrive in early 1965. And we are joined by other allied nations that were basically in what is called SEATO. It was the Southeast Asian version of NATO. South Korea will commit troops to fighting in Vietnam, as will Australia and New Zealand. And they will send troops to these countries to stop the spread of communism, but also to get better trade deals and support from the United States. And who are our domestic allies? Our domestic allies are the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, or ARVN as they're known. There also are local militias and ethnic groups like the Montagnards, Montagnard. They live in kind of mountainous regions, kind of between North and South Vietnam, and they basically just want to be left alone by everybody. But in some cases, the Montagnards become our allies against the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese, they have the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. They also have local insurgents who are generally known as the Viet Cong or the the VC, Victor Charlie, as they're known in the NATO alphabet. And the Viet Cong were South Vietnamese people who supported independence and nationalism for Vietnam and a communist government. So we're fighting a insurgency war in Southeast Asia. And how do we win this conflict without escalating it? The United States will engage in what is often called search and destroy tactics. We will use helicopters like the Huey helicopter on the right-hand side to quickly insert into enemy territory, complete objectives, and then withdraw. Victory is measured not so much in territory captured, but in the body count. How many enemies are killed compared to how many of our own troops are killed. And you can see the problems with this type of warfare. It's going to be very demoralizing for the U.S. and for the domestic population that we win the war by killing the enemy rather than capturing cities or completing prestige objectives. And of course, in many cases, as North Vietnamese or Viet Cong positions are being captured, as soon as we evacuate, they are being occupied again by the Viet Cong or by the North Vietnamese army. We also will try to build domestic support for the U.S. and for South Vietnam. You see this in attempts to what was called winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. You see this in the Strategic Hamlet program, in which rural Vietnamese communities are set up in these fortified hamlets. You see one at the bottom right-hand side of the slide, bottom left-hand side of the slide. They were fortified, better facilities would be available to the people. There would in some cases even be things like land reform, but in some cases the Strategic Hamlet program backfired because corruption would take hold in these hamlets, and people often, well, as you might guess, don't want to be removed from their homes, even if it's in exchange for promises of safety. To combat the insurgents in the jungles of Vietnam, the United States will use various chemicals in what was called Operation Ranch Hand. This involved chemicals like Agent Orange. It was called that because of its color. It's a defoliant. It's used to make the leaves fall off all the jungle trees so that the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong could not move as stealthily through the jungles. By the way, there are direct through lines from Operation Ranch Hand and Agent Orange use to the irregular warfare engaged in by early American and colonial militaries, believe it or not. Early American and colonial militaries, they preferred to attack Native Americans in the wintertime when there was less foliage on the trees because they had fallen off for the winter. This made Native Americans, it made it harder for them to attack American settlements because they could be seen more easily. And then the United States would attack the Native American settlements because they had all their supplies gathered up for the winter. So I'm not saying this is the same thing as the colonial wars, but this attacking with during defoliated periods is a similarity with the past. Another problem too with body count warfare is numbers are often inflated. U.S. forces will report that they killed 10 NVA or 10 VC insurgents and only lost one themselves. Perhaps they inflated those numbers. That way they could say that they had achieved their objectives. And on paper, the United States won the vast majority of its engagements with the North Vietnamese and with their VC allies. But again, there's going to be a push to fudge those numbers. And also, when you're dealing with body count warfare and when you're dealing with insurgencies, there is a pressure to classify civilian casualties as military casualties, which in some cases will enable what we would call war crimes against the Vietnamese people. Here are some images of the counterinsurgency type of warfare that the U.S. was engaging in the Vietnam conflict. This was advocated for by General William Westmoreland, who was in command from 1964 until 1968. Vietnamese civilians believed to have been aiding the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese could be arrested and could be imprisoned, and in some cases could be tortured and put into stress positions, as you're seeing in the image on this slide. And usually when prisoners are being interrogated and tortured, this is being done by ARVN, South Vietnamese forces. And the North Vietnamese did similar things with prisoners that they found that they had suspected were helping the South Vietnamese. So there are war crimes that are taking place and being perpetrated by a variety of factions in the war. There are new military technologies and improved military technologies that are being used by the United States during the Vietnam War. I mentioned helicopters before. Helicopters were used in the Korean War, but the technology had improved enough that they could be used for more types of military operations. In Korea, they were primarily used for scouting and evacuating critically wounded personnel. But now they can be used for insertions and other operations because they can carry more people. You also have aircraft, including B-52 bombers. B-52 bombers will engage in Operation Rolling Thunder, which was the targeting of North Vietnamese infrastructure and factories, which really was not as effective as was planned because North Vietnam was actually a very agrarian country, and they relied largely on an agrarian economy. They didn't use as many trucks and heavy equipment. They toted a lot of their supplies on things like bicycles, and they got a lot of support, particularly in the early phases of the war, from China. Um, Later in the war, they got more support from the Soviet Union, but Operation Rolling Thunder, while destructive, did not really achieve its objective of crippling the North Vietnamese economy. You also had more close-range air attacks. You had arc light. Arc light were bombings in South Vietnam itself, which could lead to civilian casualties, which is not going to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. You also have smaller aircraft dropping things like napalm. Napalm is jellied gasoline. It's very flammable and very explosive. It can be used to try to remove VC or North Vietnamese targets without having to actually send in U.S. Ground personnel. In terms of small arms, the United States begins the war using the M14 rifle. Basically, it's a automatic version of the M1 Garand, but then it's going to be phased out in favor of the M16, which you see at the top of the slide. The M16 has a smaller caliber. This weapon was designed to be more easily usable by smaller Asian allied troops, whether it's the South Koreans. They're called the ROKs commonly, ROK, Republic of Korea, the ROKs, or the ARVN. It's meant to be more available to different groups of people. The problem with the M16 is it often jams, and you can't load its magazines all the way full, otherwise basically the bullets will get stuck. So in some ways, it's actually an inferior weapon than the older M14, and that's what I've found just from my study of weapons and technology, but also looking at sources produced by veterans of the Vietnam War. This is a B-52 Stratofortress. These jet-powered bombers, they were used in Operation Rolling Thunder, the strategic bombing of North Vietnamese industrial targets from 1965 to 1968 and later. And they were also used in Operation Arc Light as well, which was basically the carpet bombing of North Vietnamese military targets and North Vietnamese military ground forces in South Vietnam and in other countries. And Rolling Thunder, they did manage to strike their targets, in some cases causing great casualties amongst North Vietnamese civilians. But the thing is, North Vietnam was a less industrial country than, say, Germany or Japan in World War II. So what had worked in the Second World War wasn't necessarily going to work in the Vietnam conflict. Vietnam was a much more agrarian nation, and they were able to get supplies from China and then from the Soviet Union to replace that which was destroyed by the U.S. strategic bombing. They also actually got help from Chinese forces rebuilding infrastructure that had been damaged by Rolling Thunder strategic bombing raids. And Arclight, while in many ways it was very successful against North Vietnamese ground forces in the south, in these carpet bombings you could see the killing of South Vietnamese citizens, which is going to get in the way of the U.S.'s grand strategy of winning over the hearts and minds of the South Korean people. Here are images of some of the less conventional U.S. air combat or air support in the Vietnam conflict. On the left-hand side of the slide is a C-123 dropping Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a defoliant that was used to make enemy troops more visible when they were moving through the jungles of Vietnam by removing the leaves. This defoliant also could kill South Vietnamese crops as well, and it's a carcinogen, and it's led to the deaths of U.S. Servicemen who handled this chemical during their time in Vietnam. I actually met a woman recently whose husband died from cancer. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he worked with Agent Orange during the conflict. And that was part of the larger Operation Ranch Hand, it was called. I also have an image of a F-4 Phantom dropping napalm bombs. Napalm was very useful for destroying North Vietnamese ground troops in South Vietnam. But of course, napalm is very explosive. It's jellied gasoline, and it can lead to collateral damage. And I've been speaking about the Vietnam conflict in very broad terms here. And the United States was struggling before 1964, before the arrival of ground troops. They were not able to create a genuine nationalist movement. The ARVN was not able to hold on to the countryside. Um, on paper, after the arrival of troops in early 65, U.S. ground troops, on paper anyway, things actually looked pretty good for the United States. The body count statistics were coming back positively. The strategic Hamlet program, while controversial and while imperfect, was yielding some success in the Vietnamese countryside. The bombing campaigns of Rolling Thunder were destroying critical infrastructure in North Vietnam. Granted, this infrastructure was not as critical as the U.S. thought, because the North Vietnamese military operated on muscle power much more than it did on trucks and tanks and things like that. But the Tet Offensive of January and February 1968 really changed public perception of the war, and it really convinced many Americans that this war was unwinnable and that it was not worth fighting. In the Tet Offensive of 1968, Tet is the Vietnamese New Year's holiday. Many Asian countries, they celebrate the New Year later than we do in the United States. In the Western world, they celebrate it in late January and February. During this period, the North Vietnamese military began making attacks in the northern part of South Vietnam. This was done to take attention away from what was coming next. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps would be focused on the NVA up here. Meanwhile, NVA, but especially Viet Cong forces, would attack major centers throughout South Vietnam, including Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City. They're going to attack and even damage the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and it's going to lead to a lot of very negative coverage of Americans in retreat, of Vietnamese civilians being killed, even of South Vietnamese forces attacking and fighting against Viet Cong. There's a famous image of a South Vietnamese police chief killing a captured Viet Cong agent, which looked like the killing of a prisoner of war. And while the person that was killed was in the Viet Cong, it didn't look good to the American people. American people began to say, this war is unwinnable. We're engaging in things that could be considered war crimes. Our allies, the South Vietnamese, are not that great. We should be looking to get out of this conflict. And President Johnson picked up on this. He began what was called the Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. That is, beginning to remove American combat troops from the war and really minimizing America's commitment to South Vietnam. And I should add that, technically speaking, the Tet Offensive was a U.S. and South Vietnamese victory. They had been able to retake the cities that they had lost, cities like Hue, which were heavily damaged by the North Vietnamese. We also see attacks on civilians in Hue by the North Vietnamese. Those cities were retaken. The Viet Cong was all but destroyed in the Tet Offensive. They're going to be much weaker for the rest of the 1960s. They're really not going to start to become a threat again until 1972. It was, tactically speaking, a victory for the United States, but strategically and in the public opinion, it was a loss, and it convinced many Americans that this war must end, or at least America must end its involvement in the conflict. In March of 1968, shortly after the Tet Offensive, the My Lai massacre took place. In this event, U.S. soldiers led by Lieutenant William Calley, they will engage in the killing of possibly as many as 340 Vietnamese villagers, most of whom had no ties to the Viet Cong insurgency. There was a cover-up, a perceived cover-up of the My Lai massacre. It did not come to light until 1969. Initially, Westmoreland, who was in command at the time, said that it was an outstanding operation. But as reports came out, particularly reports from people like Hugh Thompson, an American helicopter pilot who witnessed the massacre, he even ordered his own men to fire on the American troops if they refused to stop killing the Vietnamese. The U.S. government could no longer censor what had happened at My Lai. And really, the U.S. government is not able to censor the press and reports on the Tet Offensive or on the Vietnam War the way they could in World War II and in the Korean War. One, it's because laws about censorship had changed since the World War II years. And two, television. Vietnam is the first fully televised war in American history. Televisions were not very common during the Korean War, and also it was much easier for the U.S. to keep control of the information that was coming out of Korea than it was to keep control of the information that was coming out of Vietnam. So the American public know a lot more about what's going on in Vietnam thanks to television news, and they do eventually learn about the My Lai massacre as well. And again, this is only going to intensify the desire to end the U.S. commitment in this conflict. In the end, Lieutenant Calley, the leader of the U.S. unit, he's going to be brought up on a court-martial, and he will be sentenced to life in prison. And basically what happened was the U.S. military went from trying to hide this really a war crime to basically, you could say, throwing Calley under the bus, railroading him. That way people won't inquire about it any further, and they won't question the United States grand strategy. And in the end, actually, President Richard Nixon did commute Calley's life sentence, because while this was a war crime, the U.S. grand strategy of counterinsurgency and of body count, you can see how this sort of thing could help to encourage massacres like My Lai. You've got to stack bodies, and an easy way to do this is to target civilians and claim that they were VC. It's 1968. 1968 is considered to be one of the most divisive years in American history. The Tet Offensive has taken place. The Vietnam War is becoming increasingly unpopular. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated this year. There are nationwide protests about his assassination. RFK will be assassinated as well, one of the rising stars in the Democratic Party. Counterculture is emerging as well, although it's not going to gain the term the counterculture movement until 1969. There was a lot of social unrest, and Richard Nixon for the Republican Party, he recognizes this. He promises that he is going to bring about an end to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. He's promising peace with honor. Basically, we're going to get out of Vietnam. We're going to save American lives, but we're not going to lose that war. He's also promising law and order, because there are nationwide protests in response to the death of Martin Luther King Jr., and many of these protests are violent and involve riots. And there are counterculture protests as well. There is unrest throughout the country, both socially and culturally. As I said, the counterculture movement is emerging as well, although it's not going to be really, it's not going to have its name until 1969. And Nixon used language like the vast silent majority, that he represented everyday Americans who did not like the Vietnam War and wanted our sons and brothers to come home, but didn't want the country to lose this conflict. That were opposed to violence against African Americans, but did not support riots and breaking the law. And some opponents of Nixon and later commentators would argue that Nixon's language of law and order was coded language. Sometimes the term dog whistle tactics are used. And that really what he was doing was he was subtly signaling to racist people that he was on their side, but normal non-racist people, they wouldn't understand this. They would hear law and order, they would hear law enforcement ending riots, but really what he meant was suppressing African American activism. That's what some people have suggested. Nixon also will begin what is called the Southern Strategy. You're going to see this play out in this election and in the 1972 election, in which the Republican Party is going to reach out to white Southern voters with this law and order promise, ending riots, ending protests. Some might say also suggesting that they're going to end African American activism. Nixon, though, had supported civil rights as a younger politician, and there was still some African American outreach by the Republicans in 1968 as well. And you can see that this transition is not completed because George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, he's going to run as an independent segregationist candidate. Wallace himself being a former Democrat. The Democratic Party is divided in 1968. Many of the segregationist types are leaving the party. Some might be voting for Republicans like Nixon. Others might vote for independents like Wallace. Johnson initially, you would think, would be the favored choice, and even though he is very embattled as the incumbent because of the Vietnam War. The thing is, though, Johnson will drop out of the race after the primaries. He actually won the primary in New Hampshire, an early presidential primary, but he didn't win by the margins that he needed to win in order to be predictive of electoral success. And he was really concerned about his electability and his perception amongst people in Middle America. So he will elect to not run for he will elect to drop out of the race, rather, after the 1968 primaries begin. The initial choice after Johnson would be RFK, but RFK was assassinated in the summer of '68. So instead, the Democrats go with Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president, and he loses by not a huge margin to Nixon. And Nixon, as a candidate and as president, he was very culturally conservative. He was outspokenly anti-communist. He had been involved in anti-communist hearings back during the McCarthy era and earlier. He had actually uncovered, communist subversion in the State Department through people like Alger Hiss, for example. He had a very strong anti-communist, culturally conservative message, but Nixon was very much a smooth operator when it came to other issues. He would support more liberal economic policies, for example. And so he becomes president of the United States after the 1968 election. One last thing I'll say about Nixon is, to all appearances, Nixon's political career would have basically looked like it was over in the early 1960s. He had lost the presidency, although by a very close margin in 1960. 2 years later, in 1962, he tried to run for governor of California and lost pretty badly. He famously declared in his concession speech, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." But in 1968, he had the opening to come back into politics and actually to win the presidency. His message of law and order, of peace with honor, modulating to reach a variety of voters, it was able to deliver him the presidency in '68. Now we'll take some time to talk about the counterculture movement that emerges in the 1960s. Its genesis, in many ways, is the college free speech movement that gets going about 1960 and really is going to be around until 1974. And again, as I said before, within broader counterculture and new left activism, there is a cross-pollination of ideas between the civil rights movement, between the anti-Vietnam War movement, between the college free speech movement, and then between later more militant movements like Black Power. These organizations, or rather these protest movements, they're responding to similar things, and therefore there's a lot of overlap. And in some cases, people are going to be kind of members of both movements. Martin Luther King was a member of the civil rights movement, but he was also an outspoken anti-Vietnam War activist as well. So in 1960, Students for the Democratic Society, the SDS, is founded in 1960, also at University of Michigan, the same place that the Weather Underground starts. And SDS is going to have protests on college campuses across the country, and eventually UC Berkeley will become a major protest center in California. They will demonstrate for civil rights, anti-militarization. They're going to be very against the Vietnam War. And they're going to also demonstrate for what you might call increased freedom of expression and a more expansive college curriculum. These are silent generation and older baby boomers that are getting to be college aged. They opposed the Vietnam War. They opposed the draft that will send young people to Vietnam. Keep in mind, though, that the majority of the troops that actually go to Vietnam, the majority were volunteers, not draftees. Some draftees did end up in Vietnam, but draftees could also end up with domestic stateside service or service in Europe. And some of these protesters, they weren't just anti-war or pro-civil rights. Some of them had Marxist beliefs and ties to communist movements, especially after the mid-1960s. And they opposed the fact that college faculty had to take loyalty oaths, that you could not be a Marxist or a communist and a professor, and that the curriculum in this period in the 50s and 60s was very STEM focused. This is not a period where you could basically just be whatever major you wanted. You were going to be pressured into going into STEM. And college was much cheaper proportionally in those days, but the idea was you weren't just going to college for your own education or to get job skills. You were going into college to learn skills that were going to benefit the U.S. military effort in the Cold War. And that didn't sit well with many college students who wanted more opportunities, more flexibility in their curriculum. It didn't sit well with many faculty members either, who wanted to have what might be called a greater degree of academic freedom. Granted, academic freedom takes many different forms. And so some older professors, they support the free speech movement. They'll even have teach-ins where they'll talk about more radical topics. And the movement begins to collapse in 1974 after the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, which happened in 70, was finally done by 1973. And there were also, I should add, there were large-scale college protests across the Western world during this period. You have them in France especially, and in Germany and other European countries. There's international protests. In some ways, it's because you have a new generation of young people. The baby boomers are becoming adults, and they have a desire to differentiate themselves from previous generations. Other cultures are also responding to the same challenges that American students are responding to: the Cold War, the Vietnam conflict, and related issues. And the top image on the slide is of Jack Weinberg. He was an important activist. He was a grad student, actually, who was in the free speech movement and really the broader counterculture movement. He's the one who famously said, "Never trust anyone over 30." Here are some images related to the broader counterculture movement and what also might be called the hippie movement. Not everybody who was in counterculture was super interested in marching and in changing laws and activism. Some people got involved in the counterculture movement because they liked the aesthetics of counterculture. They liked listening to rock music. In some cases, they liked to experiment with drugs, which was a big part of counterculture, particularly experimenting with marijuana and acid or LSD. You see this in the 1967 Summer of Love at Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. You see this at the Woodstock Music Festival in New York, Woodstock, New York in 1969. Popular bands in the period like the Beatles, they really embrace counterculture as well. They protest the Vietnam War. A lot of the songs in media that are very popular in this period are anti-war songs. Rock music becomes the language of protest, or the music of protest during this period. The 60s counterculture movement is also linked in some ways to the sexual revolution as well. Sexual mores had changed in the 1950s and 1960s thanks to developments like the birth control pill, which was developed in the 50s but actually became more available in the 60s. The emergence of the second wave feminist movement in the early 60s also is one of the many causes that kind of became bound up in the broader counterculture movement. Make love, not war was an important slogan for the counterculture movement. Another really important slogan was turn in, tune in, and drop out. This was Timothy Leary, and it's really about psychedelic drug use. Expand your consciousness by experimenting with drugs. And you can see that there is a clash of cultures between the World War II generation, the greatest generation, and the baby boomer generation, as well as some of the younger silent generation people as well. That greatest generation, they had fought in the Second World War, they had lived through the Depression. Traditional religion, traditional Christianity was very important to them. The new generations were much more interested in experimenting with different religious ideas. Some of the counterculturalists were Christians. You know, Martin Luther King was an outspoken Christian. And there was what was called the Jesus Revolution, or Jesus Freak movement in California in the later 1960s and early 1970s that was Christian. But counterculturalists were very interested in Eastern religions as well. Granted, Eastern religions that had been heavily modified for Western practitioners. You really see this with the Californian guru Alan Watts. Watts mixed multiple different Eastern religions together to create what was called the Zen boom in America. And some might say that this is good because it's opening up new religious possibilities for Western people who felt disillusioned with more traditional religions. Others would say this was actually disrespectful cultural appropriation, mixing and modifying religions for new audiences, almost commoditizing and making these religions very consumeristic. And as I've mentioned before, fashion often reflects social changes and social values. In the early 1960s, the styles are still more reminiscent of mid-century fashion. They're still much more formal. Middle-class, consumerist, technocratic values are reflected for both women and men. As the 60s continue, though, as the free love movement explodes, as the sexual revolution takes hold, women begin to wear shorter skirts. The mini skirt is introduced. It's pretty scandalous at the time, but it becomes linked to the counterculture movement. In counterculture fashion, it moves away from trying to look like middle-class Americans, as MLK and his supporters originally did, and it tries to rebel against middle-class American consumerist values. You start to see people dressing a lot more informally, bright colors, tie-dye, denim become very popular. You see that men and women begin to grow out their hair into what they would see as longer, more natural styles. In fact, a lot of barbershops and beauty parlors will go out of business in the 1960s because fashion changes so much. You can even see this in clothing stores that developed during the period. The clothing store Gap, or The Gap, as you might call it, it's not a very cool store to shop nowadays. Now it has, very basic kind of preppy clothing. But in the 1960s, it was a very edgy store. And it was called The Gap because it was about the generation gap between the baby boomers and their parents. And Gap originally mostly just sold Levi's jeans, which again were part of counterculture, being more informal. And they also sold records too. Now they sell khakis and polos. And the hippie counterculture movement, they also brought in what are often called bohemian or boho styles. even a little bit of cottagecore styles as well. So sometimes they wore very short skirts, women that were in the movement. Other times they actually wore very long and flowing dresses, especially as you get out of the 60s and into the 70s, because they're trying to reject what they see as Western and American consumerist culture to get back to a what they see as a simpler and more pure way of life. You'll also see that the counterculturalists will even change the diet in America to some degree. They're going to reject a lot of the processed foods that were very popular at mid-century and try to encourage people to eat a more organic diet, to eat more natural foods and things of that nature. So they changed the diet, they changed the fashion, the hippies and the counterculturalists. They're very influential in American society. The irony, though, is while the hippies and other counterculturalists believed that they were anti-consumerist, that they were going against conformity, that they were rejecting authority. In some ways, they were basically creating new systems, new types of consumerism. Instead of buying a suit and driving a Buick sedan, family car, instead you're going to buy denim jeans and you're going to drive a Volkswagen minibus, sort of the official transportation of the counterculture movement, which talk about a brilliant rebrand, by the way, for Volkswagen. They went from being the car of the Nazis to being the car of the counterculture movement and of hippies. And they've kept that latter reputation to this day. It's in some ways, one scholar called it the conquest of cool, that this insurgent, countercultural way of doing things, in some ways, and in some sectors of society, it actually becomes the dominant culture. We're beginning to come to an end to this video in the 1960s, and I want to wrap things up by going over several important Supreme Court cases. These are cases that are useful for an American history course, and students will need to know them for taking the Florida Civic Literacy exam. To begin, we're talking about cases that are decided in the Warren Court, 1953 to 1969, which is considered to be a more liberal Supreme Court. The Warren Court was the court that decided the Brown versus Board of Education decision. They're going to expand the definition of civil rights, and they're going to broaden the U.S. government's role in actively ensuring and in protecting people's civil rights. This does mean, of course, broadening the power of the U.S. government, which was a concern for some people during the period. The main cases that you would need to know for the FCLE as someone who has taken this exam and has made study guides for it are Mapp v. Ohio, 1961, Baker v. Carr, 1962, Engel v. Vitale, 1962 as well, Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963, Miranda v. Arizona, 1966, and Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. And the image on this slide is of the Warren Court after 1967, with the addition of Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Marshall was a LBJ, Lyndon Johnson appointee. He was the first black Supreme Court justice. I'll begin with Mapp v. Ohio, 1961. The finding of this case was that evidence gathered in violation of the Fourth Amendment, which forbids search and seizures without a warrant, is not admissible in a court of law. The case began when a woman named Dolly Mapp, her house was searched in 1957 by the police in Ohio. She lived in the Cleveland area. And Mapp, we believe, was involved in illegal activity, including local organized crime and actually boxing matches of all things. And there had been bomb threats against one of the gangs, and they were investigating Mapp's house to see if there were any bombs there or if she'd had anything to do with the bombings. She refused to allow the police into her house, but they came in anyway, and during the search, they didn't find bomb-making equipment, but they did find pornographic material and gambling materials, which were both illegal in Ohio at the time. And she's going to be arrested and convicted for these other crimes. Mapp and her lawyers will sue, and they'll take their case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court is actually going to side with Mapp, 6-3. They're going to argue that the evidence that was found was not found with a legal search warrant, nor was it mentioned specifically. They were there for looking for bombs, not for pornographic or gambling material. So this case really, it offers additional protections for defendants' Fourth Amendment rights and their Fifth Amendment rights as well. And the Fifth Amendment ensures due process and that defendants cannot be made to testify against themselves. I would also argue on a cultural level, Mapp v. Ohio will be part of a groundswell of fewer restrictions on freedom of expression, and it's going to lead to things like anti-obscenity laws being overturned in the country throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Before the 1960s, arguments were made that pornographic materials, obscene materials, they were inconsistent with American culture, and that they were not protected speech, protected by the First Amendment. The Mapp v. Ohio case, while it's primarily related to the Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights of defendants, it does, I think, lead to anti-obscenity laws being struck down. The next case we'll talk about is Baker v. Carr, 1962, which is actually somewhat related to the American Civil Rights Movement. The case decided that states must draw fair congressional districts based on population to ensure that the votes of their residents all count equally. One person, one vote is the language that is going to be used. For background, it starts in Tennessee. Charles Baker and plaintiffs in cities like Memphis, urban centers in Tennessee, they argued that the state's congressional districts had not been redrawn since 1901. It had been over half a century since they were redrawn. This was a violation of the Tennessee Constitution. And what it had done was, as urban areas like Memphis and Nashville had grown, it meant that rural areas, which were much more likely to be white, had a disproportionately high level of representation, whereas urban areas, which had a disproportionately higher black population, were underrepresented. And the Supreme Court will side 7-2 in favor of Carr. That the citizens' 14th Amendment rights in Tennessee had been violated by the lack of timely redistricting, and that the new districts had to be drawn on a timely schedule, and they would have to be redrawn based on population. So this case gets cited in the future in attempts to try to create equitable congressional districts. This is another 1962 case, Engel v. Vitale. It's more famous than Baker v. Carr. In the state of New York, in 1951, a non-denominational prayer, often known as the Regent's Prayer, was established. And it was a prayer to an almighty God that would be done in schools at the beginning of the school day. And plaintiffs, namely someone named Stephen Engel, they are going to sue the state of New York that this prayer violates the rights of secular people, of atheists, and of people who do not practice Christianity or Judaism or monotheistic religions. And that ultimately politics and religion must be separate, because when religion is brought into politics and when politics is brought into religion, the two things kind of pervert each other. Supporters of the prayer argued that this prayer was non-denominational. It was not tied to a specific religion. They would also argue that according to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, Congress, that is the U.S. government, shall not make an established state religion. The states could actually do more. They could have more latitude than the U.S. government could. And then, in fact, at the time of America's founding, there still were state religions in some of the states that had once been colonies. Those states eventually got rid of their state religions, but it was the U.S. government that could not have a state religion, if you look at the specific language of the First Amendment. In the end, though, they do decide that this prayer was unconstitutional, and prayer in public schools as part of the school curriculum is going to be struck down. I should also add, too, that this prayer was non-compulsory. You did not have to participate in it if you did not feel comfortable to do so, if doing so would violate your conscience. And the Engel v. Vitale case is a landmark case. It's going to inspire other case law, like the Abington School District versus Schempp case and Lemon v. Kurtzman of 1971, which are cases that deal with religious freedom. Abington School v. Shemp was about Bible readings in the Pennsylvania school curriculum, and Lemon v. Kurtzman was about religious schools receiving government funding for their operations. This is Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963. In 1961, there was a burglary at a hotel bar in Panama City, Florida. Witnesses allegedly saw a man named Clarence Gideon leaving the scene with goods from the bar, wine bottles and things of that nature is what they thought Clarence Gideon was carrying. Gideon was from a low-income background, Gideon had been homeless for a large part of his life as well, and he was arrested and put on trial. He could not afford counsel to defend him in court. The state of Florida only provided free counsel to defendants in the cases of in capital cases, in the case of murder. And Gideon declared that he could not afford a lawyer, and therefore his Sixth Amendment rights, his right to counsel, had been violated. And the state refused to provide one for him, therefore his Sixth Amendment rights were violated. He was convicted and sent to prison. He actually, on his own, wrote a writ to the Supreme Court that took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court heard his case, and they declared that defendants who could not afford counsels would have a public defender assigned to their case, paid for by the local government and the taxpayers. And using a court-appointed lawyer, Gideon received a new trial, and he was acquitted. So this is a very important case to know for anyone who is, if you ever are in the unfortunate position of having to go on trial and you're unable to afford a lawyer, one can be provided for you via a public defender. The thing is, though, in many cases, public defenders, they're often very young, often inexperienced lawyers, and in some cases, they're often very willing to negotiate with the prosecution. The prosecution, the district attorney wants to get convictions. They want to get their conviction rate high so they look tough on crime. The public defender, though, wants to try to get clients off with as little of a sentence as possible. So they often, in some cases, will encourage the defendants to seek plea deals rather than go to trial. So it's good that we have this system, but it's an imperfect system, as all things are. This is Miranda v. Arizona, 1966. And even if you haven't heard of this Supreme Court case, you probably know a thing or two about it, and you're going to see why. In 1963, Ernesto Miranda was arrested in Phoenix, Arizona for alleged sexual assault. While he was in jail, he signed a confession without being told that he could remain silent and not have to testify against himself by signing this confession. Or he was not told as well that he had a right to counsel, which had been, that was something that had been set up by the Gideon case. It's also worth noting that English was not his first language, and he likely had an intellectual disability as well, which would have made these proceedings very confusing for him. In the end, Miranda was convicted and sentenced to prison. His lawyers will appeal the case to the state and then federal Supreme Court. Supreme Court was a bit more divided than some of the earlier cases, where one of the justices, Tom Clark, actually wrote a dissent and a concurrence. The decision, though, was that the Fifth Amendment declares that law enforcement officers must inform subjects of their right to not testify against themselves. That is, their right to remain silent, because anything you say to the police can and could be used against you in a court of law, and that's exactly what police now are required to say. You cannot be required to testify against yourself, and they will also remind you that you can receive a lawyer at no cost if you cannot afford one. That's why we have what are called Miranda rights, or if you watch police dramas, when the stars of the show, when the cops arrest someone, they'll arrest them and they'll say, read him his rights. Nowadays, law enforcement officers have these memorized because they have to say them frequently, but in the past they would have to read them off a piece of paper. And you actually see this in the 1994 film Shawshank Redemption, which is set in the mid-1960s. Without spoiling the movie, there's a really brutal prison guard that takes advantage of the prisoners, and he's eventually arrested, but the arresting officer has to read him his Miranda rights off of a sheet of paper, which is actually a really nice historical detail in what is a really excellent movie. The last Supreme Court case we'll talk about for the Warren Court in the 1960s is Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. In 1965, in Iowa, the Tinker children, who were from a very liberal and left-leaning family, they wanted to protest the Vietnam War, John and Mary Beth Tinker specifically. They were going to wear black armbands with peace symbols on them, and this was actually in violation of school dress code policies. They're dressed very nicely otherwise, as you can see from the picture, but they're wearing these black armbands. Schools, by the way, in the 1960s had much more strict dress codes. They had dress codes when it came to clothing and when it came to hairstyles as well. I've done a little bit of work on this subject. And this case makes it to the Supreme Court by 1968, and it's decided in 1969. SCOTUS will rule 7-2 in favor of the Tinker children, declaring that the students' First Amendment rights had been violated by the school dress code, which would not permit them to wear these bands. They argued that the armbands were a political statement, but they argued that these armbands did not constitute a disruption of school proceedings, and therefore it was a First Amendment right of the students to wear them. So schools could still have dress codes. They could still potentially restrict student speech in class, but they could not restrict any kind of student speech that was not a disruption to the school. So if you're a student and you bring a megaphone to school and you start shouting in class, yeah, you could be thrown out of school and punished for that, because that would be interfering with school proceedings. But if you wear a shirt with a political statement, that would not be considered a disruption to the school proceedings, as set down by the Tinker v. Des Moines case of 1969. And this will come up periodically in recent years as well. There was a student in Colorado not long ago who wore a Gadsden flag on his clothing, and he got in trouble with the school. But it was a political statement, but his rights to do so were informed by the Tinker v. Des Moines case, the Gadsden flag being more of a right-wing symbol, whereas the peace flag is more of a left-wing signal. Also, the school authorities misunderstood what the Gadsden flag was about. It's about the American Revolution. It's not about slavery, as they incorrectly thought. But this is the Tinker v. Des Moines case. It extends students' First Amendment rights. It says you can wear things with political statements, and you can make speech in school that is protected by the First Amendment, so long as it's not disruptive of school proceedings. Conclusion. In the end, the 1960s ended in a very different place than where they started. The early 1960s were a time that encouraged conformity, consistency, and unity. And even as American political culture changed in the fight for black civil rights, people believed, on the whole, that core elements of American life should not change. African Americans should have civil rights because liberty and equality were in line with American values, for example. But all of this begins to change in 1963 with the assassination of JFK, a well-liked and beloved American president, and the escalation of the Vietnam War. Many Americans, and not without reason, had felt that they'd been misled by their government about what happened to their president, about why they were in Vietnam and how that war was being conducted. And to many, America had lost its innocence as division begins to replace unity. And you really see this in statistics on government trust. They decline precipitously in the mid-1960s. Crime rates also increase significantly as well in the 1960s. The civil rights struggle that began before the 1960s is going to, in some ways, be adapted, in other ways eclipsed by the more militant Black Power movement. And you're going to see protests from a variety of different causes in the 1960s. Protests against the Vietnam War, protests against mainstream American culture, protests for increased freedom of expression, and some of these protests will escalate to violence across the country. The unity and consensus of 1960 is going to be all but gone by 1969, and politicians like Richard Nixon are going to use this division to actually rebuild their political careers and get back into the White House.